Well, in the 2 weeks ago, the last 2 weeks, I've began a 3-part series about relationship with God. 2 weeks ago, we talked about what does God know about you, and we covered the concept of knowing, knowing and what it meant when Jesus used that word that is now translated into the English. Last week, we talked about what does God remember about you, and we talked about how God forgets sins and pushes them away as far as east from west. And just trying to get the concept that God does not hold it over our heads. He's not one who tries to rub our nose in things in our relationships. And this one is entitled today, How Does God Describe You? How does God describe you? Let's turn to Revelation chapter 3, verse 21. Now, if we're asking the question, how does God describe you? That implies that he's talking about you, that he mentions your name. And if he mentions your name, the obvious question is, to whom is he speaking? Who's listening? I mean, if he's describing you to someone, who would he be describing you to? Now, the handout has a lot of verses on it that I'm not going to be taking the time to read. I just wanted to give you a thorough study about how Christ is sitting at the right hand. The Son is sitting on the right hand of the Father. Now, you know that, and of course, that is one of the basic foundational points of Christianity. That's one of the basic foundational points of the Church of God. That Christ, the Son of God, died, he suffered for you, he died for you, and then the Father raised him. And so the Bible's full of that, and a lot of those scriptures come from a psalm back in Psalm 110, verse 1, that is quoted numerous times through the New Testament. And so I gave you some scriptures there. I'm not going to go read through all of them. I'm just going to pick a few out. But I wanted to read this one, Revelation 3, verse 21. It's interesting, as the Son is talking, it's red letter. And as he's talking about characteristics in congregations back at the time of the early New Testament church. And, of course, those characteristics can apply in churches today in our modern time. And we want to learn the lessons of all 7 congregations. We want to learn the things that they did well and the things they did poorly. And, of course, much of the encouragement finally is that once you overcome these things, once you learn from these lessons, all 7 lessons, then you can receive God's blessings and God's great blessings that he promises. To the church at Laodicea, to the congregation there, he talks in verse 21, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne. So again, he's talking about an opportunity to serve, not an opportunity to crush, not an opportunity to spank, not an opportunity to domineer over, but an opportunity to serve. In what ways, he'll explain all that to us. But we can sit on his throne, he says, just as I also overcame, and I sat down with my Father on his throne. So again, we learn a lot from that little verse there, that the analogy of the throne, the analogy of ruling and serving and loving, and the Father's on his throne, and then here the Son was able to have a throne right beside him. And there's many scriptures in the Bible about sitting at the right hand of the Father. And I'd like to just read maybe one. Let's look at Acts chapter 7, verses 55 and 56. As I said, I have many verses in the handout. I don't think I have all of them, but I believe I have most of them, about sitting at the right hand of God. And it's just a very positive message to go through those verses by themselves. But let's look at Acts chapter 7, verses 55 and 56. This is Stephen, and this is the story of Stephen. And as he was being murdered, as he was being killed for challenging the religious system, going against the hierarchy, going against the leaders who were oppressing the people, as he did this, he gave them a history lesson. Then he did insult them, and if he hadn't insulted them so strongly, he might have lived. But he felt it was a time to insult them, and he did. He corrected them, and they were very angry. But as they were then inflicting pain on him, as they were inflicting death on him, I want you to see his reaction. But he, being full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, But he also saw Jesus, the Son, standing at the right hand of God. Now again, these phenomena that happen, when people have these phenomena and tell me about them, I don't like to ignore them. I can't always describe them. It's easy to look at something written in the Bible because people accept the Bible, and then they can somehow come to grips with that. But when someone comes up to you and tells you about something they experienced that is Bible-like, we sometimes wonder, did it really happen? Well, we're skeptical about that. And I can't always define it. When people will tell me things that happen, people will tell me that someone prayed for them and they got better, and different things that happen. And I can't describe, I can't explain all of them. All I know is I don't ignore them, and I will know conclusively in the kingdom which have been directly from God and which have been, whatever other things it could have been. But he saw the glory of God. And he saw Jesus, the Son, standing at the right hand of God. And he said, "Look, I see the heavens opened. I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." So again, we're asking the question, who would the Father talk to about this? If the Father were going to describe you, who would he describe you? And so we see many scriptures in the Bible that he certainly could talk about you to the Son of God. Now, on the next page of the handout, there's also angels. There are angels around. Let's look at Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4. That there are angels around the throne of God. Angels are a great, interesting thing to study. The description in the Bible are interesting about 4 heads at times and many eyes. And it looks like science fiction stuff. And again, I think if we saw the angel, according to some of the examples in the Bible, if some of those were made to be us to see them, they would scare us. That we'd be frightened by the appearance because the appearance is different than what we would understand. But this is the Bible description, like Revelation 4:4. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And of course, from the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices, 7 lamps of fire burning before the thrones, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the middle of the throne, around the throne, were 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and back. Now again, a person could study that. That'd be an interesting study if you want to just study about angels in the Bible. It can be really interesting. But I'm not really wanting to dwell on all that as much as I'm asking the question about how does God describe you? And of course, so the question would come up, who would he be describing you to? Is he talking to himself? Or is he talking to part of the angelic world and talking to the Son of God sitting at his right hand? So again, he certainly did. So now let's look at a couple examples in the Bible to see how God had talked about people, and then we can try to project in your life, as your personal relationship with God, what would he say about you? Probably the most famous example, or maybe the second most famous, is Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18. Now, of course, we're going to talk about Abram or Abraham. Now, someone could say, well, yeah, this guy's pretty famous. Yes, he was. And we're going to talk about Job, and he's pretty famous. And David and Peter and Paul, and yes, they're all very famous. But he talks about his children. He talks about his children. And interesting enough, would God ever say something like this about you? Friends, he would at times. Probably not every day of your life. And I don't think he could say this about Abraham every day of Abraham's life either. Now, some of the patriarchs, some of them were conniving. Some of the parents had favoritism in their children. And some of the parents got involved in misdirection and lies. So again, when you see these examples, this was not about a person every day of their life. I want you to take comfort in that, but I would hope that there would be times in your life that he would say things like this to you. Genesis chapter 18, verse 17. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? He's talking to somebody. He's talking to somebody saying, should I hide what I'm doing with him? since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. Wouldn't it be great if he could look down at you and say that you're important in your family, that you believe in the way of God, and that you are a person of justice and judgment? That's one of the greatest lacks in mankind today. There's just not justice in the land. You know, we like to honor those who do provide justice. And I know I talked to George Crow about, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, about some situations in life. And we were commenting about, he was pointing out different examples where some of the judges make the right decision, and how sometimes the judges in the land will make a decision based on principle. And we were talking about some of that, and he was pointing out that some of that I may not have realized. That when I saw a decision by a judge, he would tell me, you realize that was a very honorable decision, because most of the time people would go this way, and people would come to this conclusion. And in this situation, that judge did the right thing, even where he might be ridiculed by his community. And so again, he could point that out, but there's not a lot of justice in the land. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of justice in families, and just in general. And so we want to be people of justice. We want to be people of seeing what's right and wrong, and then how to handle what's right and how to handle what's wrong. We want to be people of justice and judgment in our lives. And so Abraham, he's looking at him saying, this is how I would describe Abraham. At that moment anyway, not every day of his life, not every second of his life, but I hope that there would be positive things that God could say about me and God would say about you, that he sees, because he sees everything we do. So it's not a matter of whether he sees or not, it's a matter of are we doing it or not. And I'm hoping then that when he describes us, he can look down and say, that's my boy, that's my girl, that's my son, that's my daughter, that's part of my family. And look at them, they're really learning. Look at them, they're really growing. Now again, it's important to realize that, because you may get down on yourselves a lot when you make mistakes. You may get down on yourselves, and you may look and say, that was a stupid decision you may have done, or that was a stupid reaction that you had. And you may be right about that. They may have been bad decisions. They may have been bad reactions. But the fact is, we're not defined by every mistake we ever make. We're defined exactly how we move forward from our mistakes. By the way, we're not defined by every success we have either, because every day's a new day, and so we have to keep moving forward. But there's the example of Abraham. Let's look at the example of Job. You know, when I mentioned earlier about Abraham may be the most famous example, and then it crossed my mind, maybe Job is more famous. Job chapter 1, verse 1. Look at how God described Job. Now again, we see in the writing of the book of Genesis, it quoted God. This one's a little interesting. This is more interesting here in Job, because it's not really attributing God as the author of these words. So thereby, the skeptics like to point out that Job was awful full of himself to write about himself this way and say these things about himself. And so I happen to believe that this is a good example of someone saying what's true, and not necessarily just as a point of vanity, not blowing his own horn. But could God describe you this way? There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright. Now, blameless and upright, that does not mean Job never made mistakes. That's not what that English word would mean. I mean, that's not, the Hebrew word would not imply he never made a mistake. Now, how do I know that? By the whole book of Job. Because in the book of Job, in chapters 1 and 2, Job had great reactions. In Job 1, verses 20 to 22, after all those trials came on his family and business, he had a great reaction. Then in Job 2, when he had health problems, and God allowed health problems to come, Job had a great reaction. And as I like to say, and I like to point this out because I think most people do not understand the book of Job and they misapply the book of Job. And I'm talking about religious people. I'm not talking about atheists. I'm talking about many religious people misapply the book of Job. And it's my belief that many Church of God people misapply the book of Job. It's just my opinion, because many people think that Job suffered because he made a mistake. Well, that's what the three friends said. The three friends said, "What'd you do wrong? What'd you do wrong?" And so they say he suffered for that, but that's not the case. The case was he was doing what's right here. And the story of the book of Job was God said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" I'm sure Satan may have been looking at his iPhone. He may have been looking at his iPhone, texting someone, and all of a sudden God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Satan probably lifted his head up and thought, "Now this is interesting. This is a conversation. Let's check out this conversation here. What do you mean, your servant Job? You protect him. You put this hedge around him." And then that's when Satan said, if you do this and do that and do this and do that, he'll curse you. And God said, "Okay, I'll give you freedom to do that." And then later on, the second trial was about his health. And again, he responded well, Job did. But the thing was, after chapter 2, because in fact, one time in interactive Bible study, one of our congregations was pointing out how Job had this great reaction. And I pointed out, yes, he had a great reaction in chapter 1 and chapter 2. If the book of Job ended right at that moment, we could say Job had a great reaction through the book of Job. But after chapter 3 verses on, he did not have a great reaction. And I'm not trying to be hard on him. I'm just trying to deal with reality. In fact, that reality can be helpful to you and to me. The fact is, there are days we don't have a great reaction. And yet God loved Job, and God loves you. And so, yet, when he says Job was blameless and upright, it meant he did a lot of good things. In fact, he said even more, chapter 2, verse 3, he said again, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth?" Wow. He was the best thing going. What a description that would be. So, none like him on the face of the earth. All those positive qualities, acted like an idiot. None like him on the face of the earth had bad moments. And Job's sin, by the way, is he multiplied words without knowledge. That's what the Bible says. We're not really going through the book of Job in great detail today. But he multiplied words without knowledge. That was his big sin. So he started just rattling on saying, "God's out to get me. It's not worth being a Christian. It's not worth being with God because he's mean and horrible. It's not worth it." And that's what he said. You can see those quotes right out of the book of Job. So even a guy who could stoop to that level was the best thing going. Blameless and upright. Now you may say that you're not as good as Job. Well, it's not really competition. But you sometimes can be as bad as Job. And God still loves you. You can still be grumpy. You can still sometimes get to the point thinking God's out to get you and realize that's wrong. Sometimes you get to the point of thinking it's not worth being a believer, and then you come to your senses and say that's wrong too. But the Father who knows you, the Father who forgives and forgets and remembers, sometimes also will say, "I'm not going to describe him that way. I'm not going to describe him by his worst moments." That's unfortunate because of the Bible. Some people will be remembered for their worst moments. Now, David wasn't remembered for his worst moments, but he's certainly remembered for bad moments. But, the poor ladies who were prostitutes, these are the poor ladies who are known there. The poor church in Corinth. The poor church in Corinth was noted as a really horrible congregation. They just went through a bad time. Our congregation looks different. If you take a snapshot of our congregation, when we started in 1995, when we had our certain times in 1998, 2004, 2011, 2018, our congregation will look different. We'd like our congregation to always be on an upturn, close to God. And that's right there in front of us. We want that. And if any mistakes we make as individuals or as a congregation or as neighbors or as workers, as bosses, all those things can be changed. But anyway, Job was doing good things. He was out there doing good things, and yet he was making mistakes. I would like to think that there's times that God calls you blameless and that God calls you upright. And God says that you fear him, and God says that you shun evil. That means there's a lot of that going on in your life, even in spite of who you are, even in spite of the mistakes you make. Let's go to David. Let's look first at a psalm. Psalm 89. Let's look at David real quickly. We looked at Abraham, we looked at Job. Psalm 89, verses 20 through 23. And the reason why I'm quoting this, reason why I'm using this verse, this is the verse that's quoted in the book of Acts, when the book of Acts calls David a man after God's own heart. This is the verse it's quoting from. Psalm 89, verses 20 through 23. This is verse 20 is where he's quoting from. I have found my servant David. With my holy oil I have anointed him, with whom my hand shall be established. Also my arm shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him, nor the son of wickedness afflict him. I will beat down his foes before his face and plague those who hate him. He's talking about his relationship there for someone he loved desperately, someone he loved. Now, if you understand, he loved Job, and Job went through trials. He loved David, and David made mistakes. How could David be someone God would have good descriptions about? Let's look at Acts chapter 13, verse 22. Acts chapter 13, verse 22. This reminds me of the parable again that my friend Bernie Monsalvo says I get a lot of mileage out of. But it's the parable of the publican, the tax collector, and the Pharisee. Because in that situation, the Pharisee did a lot of good things in the parable. The tax collector did a lot. Well, it doesn't mention all his bad things. It just mentions that he repented. And the point of the parable is which one is justified, which one is honored, which one was approved. And of course, it's the one who made the adjustments, who accepted God's grace, who accepted God's mercy and repented, reached out for that mercy and accepted it. And so again, how would God view you? Well, hopefully we're a combination of the two. Wouldn't it be great if we're a combination of the two? That we are a religious person who's doing good things and is repenting? That's the ideal. A religious person who's doing good things and repenting. But the contrast in the parable was, if you're doing good things and looking down at other people, or if you're a person who does bad things, but you realize you're bad and you turn to God and you get it behind you, the story of the parable is that the tax collector, the cheating tax collector, was better off. Now again, as I said, we would like to be a combination of the two. We would like to be a religious person who does good things without feeling superior to others and without looking down at others. We'd like to do good things because we're in the service of God, to the glory of God. That's why we'd like to do. But here it was, Acts 13, verse 22. This is Paul talking about a history lesson. He said, when he had removed him, talking about Saul, he raised up for them David as king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. And of course, this is taken from that psalm we read. That David was anointed with oil as the leader, and this is taken from that. Paul's quoting from that, paraphrasing it, and talking about that. But the testimony is, he's a man after my own heart. And it says doing all my will. I mean, here's someone What was adultery after God's will? Of course not. Was murdering after God's will? Of course not. So when you and I sin, when we sin, that's not after God's will. But what do we do when we sin? How do we respond from the sin? That's how we can be someone who accepts God's love for us. He's our dad. He's our father, the perfect father. And we can move forward instead of allowing our mistakes to crush us. We learn from our mistakes and move forward. Let's look at Peter, John chapter 13, verses 8 and 9. Now, thinking about David, would God describe you like David? Would God describe you like his son, the apple of his eye? But yet yet you make mistakes. You do realize parents love their children, even when they know their warts and flaws. Now, so there are times when children can. I don't want to make anyone feel badly if you have a situation with your children where you have distance from them. There may be reasons why you do. Every situation is different. There are situations where you need a little space from your kids, so I don't want to make anyone feel bad who's hearing in the hall or hearing this on the website. But ideally, you always love your kids, even if you have some challenges with them. And again, when I hear about some of the challenges people have with their children, it's sad. It is sad. And what's really sad to me is watch children not be loved. That's really sad to me. And when I see that, and I have to be honest, 30 years ago, you can always count on a mother's love. You can always count on a mother's love in many cases. But with women's liberation and feminism, women are now proving that they can be just as carnal as men. They're just proving they can be just as bad as men. And so I'm not exonerating men for the stupid things we as men do. I'm not exonerating men at all. I'm just saying women, unfortunately, are catching up. And there are now mothers who really don't show that love. You can count on that years and years ago where a mom was always going to be there for their child. Many times when the dad wasn't. And the good news is sometimes some of the men are stepping up. Because when the mother's not doing it, some of the men are stepping up. And I'm talking about society in general. I'm not talking about any situation or any specific situation. I'm talking about society in general. And of course, ideally, we'd like to all be able to show that kind of love. Now, here's a story of Peter. There was a man in the Church of God history called Herbert Armstrong. It's real interesting about this, and just for those who don't know, he was a long time ago. He's long since passed away, and he was involved with many of the Church of God branches. And there are people in those churches of God about him who do one of two things. They either like to crush him and say horrible things about him, or they like to idolize him. And both of those are wrong. It's real interesting. You can mention to some people who idolize him, you can say Noah got drunk. You can say David committed adultery. You can say Peter was prejudiced around the leaders from Jerusalem. But they wouldn't even call him Herbert. You could call Noah Noah. You can call Peter Peter. You can call David David. But they wouldn't even call him Herbert. And that was a horrible sign right there. Well, I sometimes, to help people come to grips with him as a person, I sometimes say I'd like to liken Herbert to the Apostle Peter. Does that sound pretty good? Hey, it doesn't get much better than the Apostle Peter, right? Now let me tell you how I liken him or others. Peter here, look at Peter's personality. John 13, verse 8. Peter said to him, "You'll never wash my feet." Pretty dogmatic. Very dogmatic. And Jesus answered, "If I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me." Well, dogmatic Peter said, "Lord, don't wash my feet, only wash all of me." That was Peter. "You'll never wash my feet. Now you'll wash all of me." And so there are people, and some preachers, you watch some preachers who are televangelists, they're like that. So dogmatic. There are preachers in the church of God who are so dogmatic. It's almost like it's a trait people have. They're so dogmatic. And they're just bouncing around. They're just dogmatic this way. You'll never wash my feet. And then they'll be over here. You'll wash all of me. People like that. I say this. When they're right, they're right. And when they're wrong, they're wrong. And that's the way I view all preachers. That's the way I view Herbert Armstrong. He was at times very, very right, and at times he was very, very, very wrong. Now again, if you recoil at that, then you may be putting him on a pedestal you shouldn't be putting him on. I just compared him to the Apostle Peter. When Billy Graham's right, he's right. When Billy Graham's wrong, he's wrong. When the Pope is right, he's right. When the Pope is wrong, he's wrong. Any preacher you listen to, when they're right, they're right. When they're wrong, they're wrong. Some people are more mellow. Some preachers are more mellow. Some preachers are very dogmatic. And Peter's out there. So how about you? Now let's bring it down to your level. Sometimes, folks, God looks at you that way. You are so excitable. You are so dogmatic. You are so energetic that sometimes your dad looks at you and says, man, you are just on fire and you are just doing so well. And other times he looks at you and scratches his head and says, boy, you're kind of off the rails here. You missed the turn on this one. Now what does he do? Does he burn you at the stake? He loves you. He loves you. And so, again, there's nothing wrong with zeal. We want to be right when we're zealous. But when you're wrong, when you're zealous, God still will be there for you if you allow him. Let's look at the last example, Paul, over in Philippians chapter 3. Well, I won't have time to read all of it, but I'm going to explain it because it's easier than taking the time to read it because of time. In Philippians chapter 3, verses 3 through 14, Paul was a kind of individual who had every reason to look down at other people. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was of the right tribe. He had the right background. He had the right training in the law. He had the right training in the traditions. I mean, if anyone wanted to argue, he knew his Bible back at a time when there were scrolls. He knew various languages. This man was very, very capable. And yet, he said in Philippians 3, verses 3 through 14, you'll read it later, he said, I'll give that all up for the relationship with the Son of God. I will give it all up to understand the sufferings of Christ. I will give it all up to understand the death of Christ. I will give it all up to understand the resurrection of Christ. I will give it all up to feel the love of the Father, and I will give it all up to express the love of the Father. I will every day of my life try to do the right thing. I will try to learn and grow, which would include repenting. And brethren, I tell you this because some of you are well trained in the Bible, and some of you are well trained in the way of life, and that's good. But if you're only well trained in, like Paul was well trained as a Pharisee of Pharisees, if you're only well trained but don't have that personal relationship, you realize it's not the ultimate situation, but thankfully it's not the end of the story. Paul actually had to have a road to Damascus experience to get that. So sometimes you'll go through a trial situation, a heavy situation, to come closer to the Father. Sometimes you have to go through something that you can't take care of yourself. You can't fix it yourself, and no one else can fix it for you. And then you'll be able to have that relationship with God and to really grow and to learn. So that's why we don't look for the perfect church. We don't look for the biggest church. We don't want to get stuck in it. We don't want to slip back into a system that's not good. We want to have a system of doing the right thing, learning from the right way, But after doing so, we want to have a relationship with him where he is our Father. We are his kid. And he describes us and looking down at us and says, boy, you're not perfect, you make mistakes, and I still love you, but that was good. That you trusted me there, that was good. You showed love there, that was special. That was really good. Well, brethren, I thank you for your time today. I thank you for listening to the three-part series. What does God know about you? What does God remember about you? How does God describe you? I hope he describes you as a son of God, a child of God, who is repenting and learning and growing and wants to show that love back to him